Good morning, or if you're in the U.S., good afternoon. I'm Charles Edel, the Australia Chair and Senior Advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks to everyone for tuning in online today. Now, after weeks of fast-paced campaigning and robust election, Australia's federal election was held this past Saturday on May 3rd. After a roller coaster ride in the polls over the past several months, the election ended with a surprise blowout and a decisive outcome for Labor. After predictions that at best Labor would be forced into minority government, it instead emerged with a sizable majority for its second term. Moreover, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese looks particularly formidable after this election. This election is being described in historic terms: the scale of the victory, Labor's increasing political strengths, and the Prime Minister's own faction gaining seats all point to a government that will be more secure in its instincts as it heads into its second term. The landslide victory for Labor and the wipeout for the Liberals will affect both parties, and they'll also affect the direction of the Australian government. Now, while domestic politics were a top priority for voters, foreign policy and national security did play a role as the campaign developed. This was due to concerns sparked by China's circumnavigation and live fire drills around Australia in March, the Trump administration's tariffs against Australia, and the questions on the durability of AUKUS under a new U.S. administration. As is true in the United States, as is true in Australia, elections may or may not be about foreign policy and national security, but they always carry implications for the country's general orientation and its relations with the rest of the world. This is especially true as Australia finds itself in a changing security environment, as we've heard repeatedly, the most dangerous one since World War II. Now, tonight, we're going to explore this foreign policy and the national security implications flowing from the election. To do so, I'm thrilled to welcome three of Australia's leading commentators, Stephen Dziedzic, Chris Uhlmann, and Laura Tingle, to offer their insights on the election results, national security and defense priorities, and likely implications for Australia's foreign policy. Laura Tingle has reported on Australian politics for more than 40 years and has worked for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation since 2018 as political editor for the ABC's 7:30 program. She previously held senior positions in print media, reporting on finance, economics, and politics, including more than a decade as political editor of the Australian Financial Review. From 2020 to 2025, she was president of the National Press Club of Australia. Chris Uhlmann was political editor for both Nine News and the ABC. His three co-authored works of political fiction were made into a Netflix miniseries, Secret City, which I recommend to everyone. With independent filmmaker Screencraft, he has written and presented documentaries on the Ukraine war and the cost of net zero. He is a columnist with The Australian and a political contributor on Sky News. Last but certainly not least, Stephen Dziedzic is the Australian Broadcast Corporation's Foreign Affairs Asia-Pacific reporter, based in the National Broadcaster's Parliament House Bureau in Canberra. He covers foreign policy and Australia's relationship with countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Stephen has worked for the ABC since 2007 and spent 5 years covering federal politics before moving to his current position. I'm thrilled to have them all here to discuss Australia's election and its likely effects on the direction of Australian foreign policy. The four of us will discuss the election for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we'll take online questions if you have them. For everyone who's watching this, if you have questions for the panelists, please go to the event webpage on the CSIS website and fill out the question form. We'll do our best to get as many of your questions as possible. Now, without further ado, I'd like to jump right in. Laura, we're going to start with you. Can you please start by telling us what just happened? Help our audience understand the election, its stakes, its outcome, the composition of the new government, its policy orientation, the cabinet composition. How should we understand what happened on Saturday?
Well, thanks, Charles, and hello, everybody in Washington and elsewhere. Yes, I think a few of us are actually sort of saying what just happened a little bit after Saturday night, because it was an extraordinary result. Just to put it in context, it is very unusual. In fact, the last time it happened was 1931, that a first-term government doesn't get returned. But despite that, the economic circumstances in Australia are sort of, for a lot of people, a once-in-a-lifetime economic shock from the inflation surge we saw around the world. created the circumstances where the opposition parties believed that they could mount a credible attack on the government and win. And of course, this is in the context of a world where Australian governments have really only held a very slim majority in the parliament over the last decade or so. So, you lose 2 or 3 seats and you're out, partly because we've got the rise of independents on what we call a crossbench. So we went into the election with all of this anger in the community about the fact that they were really doing it very, very tough. As I said, for the first time for a lot of people, we've been blessed by resources booms and really good times, and by governments always just giving us stuff. Since the Howard era in the 1990s, there hasn't been a period where governments have taken things away. So you had this centralist government which was looking to provide relief via measures in the budget, like helping with childcare fees and things like that. But a lot of it wasn't particularly materially conspicuous to the public. The government was very concerned to try to build up its economic credibility, because Labor always seems to have this position as being the lesser of the two parties in terms of being an economic manager. And this was being pushed very, very hard by the coalition. So what happened that led to this result? Well, I think there are a few things that happened. First of all, we were told this was going to be a cost of living election. The government went into the election having a suite of policies that it could point to, whether people thought that they were good or not. You also had a changing economic backdrop. Interest rates finally started to fall just before the election was officially underway. And also really basic things like petrol prices fell throughout the election campaign. Now, this was a bit of a problem for the coalition in particular, because its main problem was it didn't have any policies. It certainly didn't have any serious policies about a very different economic agenda. It was saying that Australia was, had to get back on track, but it didn't actually provide any coherent policy framework for a very different economic management system. Its main sort of tax initiative to help with the cost of living was to take excise off petrol prices at the pump, about 25 cents. That was only going to be for a year. And in a decision which the government could not believe its luck on, it announced that it would repeal a series of small tax cuts that the government had announced as a cost of living measure. So we went into the campaign. It was supposed to be about cost of living. The coalition not only didn't have any policies as it transpired, but kept on saying we're about to announce them any day now, which they've been saying for 3 years. They didn't announce them, or when they did, they were really lacking in detail. And the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, had really managed to maintain a very low profile through the 3 years of government, didn't really do much media. And when the voting public saw him, they sort of thought, actually, we're not sure about this guy. I mean, he said that he's strong. He said that that the Prime Minister is weak, which was because the Prime Minister sort of takes these more sort of central, cautious positions. And he was saying, look, I'm going to be really strong. And in the American context, of course, he said, I'd be much stronger at dealing with the US president. But what they actually saw was an opposition leader who was flip-flopping. He kept changing his mind on policies. He couldn't articulate what he stood for. And over the course of the campaign itself, we saw the politics of Australia completely transformed. I mean, it's very unusual to see a campaign being so pivotal to events in Australia, but they were. And at the same time, we saw the Prime Minister sort of really get his act together. I used to joke that if you were asking the Prime Minister a question in a broadcast interview, you'd ask him the question and he could go off and put the washing on, because he did tend to waffle on a bit. He became much tighter in his messaging, much more confident in his presentation. And when issues came up like President Trump's Liberation Day, he was very well prepared for it, rhetorically and in terms of saying, look, this is not the act of a friend. He had the nuances of the language right, which was assertive but not, there wasn't any retribution in it. He was being the adult in the room. And he made clear that we had been discussing our trade relationships with a whole range of other people in the meantime, and that essentially Australia would just get on with what it had to get on with while America worked out what it wanted to do. So the Trump factor was another one. Without a doubt, President Trump's tariffs announcement in particular unnerved people. It made them much less prepared to take a risk on a change of government, whatever change that was. So as Charles has said, we've ended up with this position where the opposition is reduced to a rump, and it really doesn't know where it's going to go, and won't for some time, I don't think. But I think in terms of where it's left the government, it's really fascinating, both in terms of domestic politics, but in terms of our international position. If you remember, we went into the 2022 election with Labor effectively just jumping on board the AUKUS project, largely because they didn't want any difference in perceived relationships with the United States to the coalition. Now, it's still on board for AUKUS. There's been no suggestion it wouldn't be, but it now doesn't carry that baggage with it. And of course, Australians' views of the United States or of the administration are now very wary. In the meantime, of course, Australia's repaired its relationship with China, and I think it gives the government and the Prime Minister the confidence to just look in hopefully a fairly clear-eyed way about how we deal with this rather wild world that we're facing. I might leave it there, Charles.
Yeah, that's terrific, Laura. You've teed up, I think, a ton of issues for us to discuss, everything from what role Donald Trump actually did play in the election to the narrative of the stabilization between Australia and China. So we're going to suss all these out, but I think understanding the domestic strengths that Albanese has coming out of the election is a really useful starting point. Stephen, I'd like to head over to you. You write on foreign affairs on a regular basis. And I guess the initial question must be, where did foreign policy go during this election? It seemed that it might make an appearance given events, the Chinese circumnavigation of Australia, rumors of a potential Russian bomber fleet coming out of Indonesia, of course, President Trump's tariff trade war, but to a certain degree, kind of like a submarine, it disappeared from sight for a long while. Why did that happen? What's your take about the role that foreign affairs did or did not play? How come it wasn't seen as a salient political issue?
Yeah, I like the submarine analogy, Charles. That's quite a good one. And it is in a way extraordinary that foreign policy and foreign affairs didn't play a bigger role in this election. I mean, I think in the end, the main reason it didn't is because for most voters, their main preoccupations remain domestic overwhelmingly rather than international. I think that's partly because most Australians still haven't really come to grips or internalized just how rapidly our strategic circumstances are deteriorating at the moment. And as Laura said, the inflation surge, the fact that we've had a cost of living crisis, as it's called here, and that people are feeling economic pain, in the end, that was the main preoccupation, I believe, for most voters. The other thing, of course, is, as you've hinted at there, whilst events did roll on, there wasn't a crisis during this campaign internationally, as we saw last time, with the China Solomon Islands security deal breaking. You might remember that news broke right in the middle of the last campaign, and it probably did, fairly or not, do quite a bit of damage to the coalition's national security credentials. Labor called that the greatest strategic disaster or blunder for Australia in the Pacific since World War II. And at least for a couple of weeks, it was one of the major issues of the campaign. This time around, we didn't have anything quite like that. There was, as you said, a flurry of reports about Russia looking to base bombers in Indonesia, credible reports, incidentally. But Indonesia came out pretty quickly to say that wouldn't happen, which largely, though not entirely, sort of nullified it as a major campaign issue. There was, as you say, as well, another strategic shock just before the election with the partial circumnavigation of Australia by the PLA flotilla that we saw. That did, I think, register with voters, but it had kind of ebbed away a little bit by the time that we went to the polls. I guess probably the main reason, though, I think that we didn't have a huge foreign policy, debate during this election is because there is still awfully a large amount of consensus over most foreign policy issues in Australia. Yes, there are some sharp exceptions to that, including on Israel and Gaza. But in the end, when it comes to the main strategic questions around dealing with Trump and around China, whilst there are some differences, there's also an awful lot of common ground. And that, I think, more than anything else, explains why, for example, we didn't have a foreign policy debate during the election, something that I think is personally faintly astounding, given everything that's happening in the world right now around us, and how high the stakes are for Australia. I guess, of course, the one thing that did, of course, have an effect is Trump, and the US president did, in ways, as Laura sort of intimated before, loom over this contest. My assessment, for what it's worth, and I really do, I'm not saying this, I really do defer to both Laura and Chris on this question. They'll have a far better grasp of this. But is that it did deliver at least a modest boost to Labor, perhaps more than a modest boost. That happened, I think, in two ways, and this is the assessment that I've sort of pulled out of people who watch these things in both parties as well. One, there was an incumbency boost for Labor. It wasn't nearly as pronounced, obviously, as we saw in Canada, but it did, as Laura said, make people feel anxious broadly about the state of the world, which probably weighed against change, and in particular weighed against Dutton, who was successfully, whether it's fair or not, you can argue, but framed as a risk by Labor. And then, of course, Labor also made extensive efforts to try and cable tie Dutton to Trump. This was helped by elements within the coalition, but it was largely a political effort that Labor made. And I think to some extent that did break through. Two quick anecdotes on this. One coalition source told a newspaper, and I think the same one perhaps told me the same thing, namely that their polling tracked unnervingly with Trump's. Now there was some coalition polling that showed they had a better chance than actually turned out to be the case, but they also had other polling, I'm told, that was less optimistic, and they said that their polling started to list a little bit pretty much as soon as Trump took office. They said that after the Volodymyr Zelensky confrontation in the Oval Office, it dipped down again, and then he said, at least for some of our polling, the floor fell out as soon as Liberation Day happened. Now, even if that's a little bit too neat a story, and the reality is more shifting and complex, I think there's some truth in that. The other thing is that a number of Labor MPs told me that when they went door knocking, Trump was raised pretty constantly. One Labor MP told me it was raised in his electorate by about 80% of voters who he spoke to, and he said that it was breaking in their favour about 90% of the time. I don't have a clear sense of how decisive Trump was. It's very difficult to really drill down into this, but I think it's safe to say it was at the very least a factor in the election, and one that certainly helped to propel Labor to what is a pretty extraordinary victory.
Thanks, Stephen. And one of the, I like how you sketched some of the reasons that foreign policy was not brought to the fore, because there really is so much that is consensual. But I also, in a little bit, want to dig into some of those differences, even some of the differences on the campaign trail, particularly around issues like the size and the speed of liquidity into the defense budget, which was a clear difference, I think, between the two parties. But Chris, I actually want to swing from what was on voters' minds to what's going to be on the government's mind. We'll have a couple of days, we'll have a little bit of a sorting, a little bit of a break, but they're going to be at it sooner than they might anticipate. And regardless of whether it was a defining feature on the campaign trail, it's going to be a central preoccupation of the next government. So I'd be curious for your take, what's in the inbox? What are the priority issues that you think that the government will have to tackle from a foreign policy and national security perspective? How do you think the Albanese government, now that it has majorities and quite secure majorities clearly in the House, is going to position itself on some of the issues? Over to you.
Well, the main issue for us is, as it's always been, which is we're stuck between the United States, which is our key ally, and China, which is our major trading partner. And we're trying to navigate that world with essentially an ant wandering between elephants at the moment as they conduct this great strategic dance. Now, we always thought that the biggest problem that we were going to have was with the Chinese president. It turns out that our biggest problem at the moment is with the American president. And as Stephen says, it wasn't the only factor in this election campaign, but it absolutely was a factor. And in the Australian Prime Minister's inbox at the moment is, how does he deal with the United States? Don't forget that the Australian electorate and the Australian Labor Party has just shunted to the left. And on the left of Australian politics, there has always been a concern about the relationship with the United States. That concern exists certainly in the far left, which is the Greens. They've become a bit less of a force, but it absolutely exists inside the Labor Party. And AUKUS has never really been a creature of the Labor Party. There's been deep suspicion of it. People felt that they were driven into that position, as Laura basically pointed in that direction during the last election campaign, that they either signed up for AUKUS or they were being seen to not being on board with our major allies. So they felt in some ways blackmailed into that. Now, I do believe that the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and certainly the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, I think that they're signed up to that campaign. I don't know that an enormous amount of the rest of Cabinet is entirely, emotionally tied to AUKUS, and everything that Donald Trump drives them further away from that. I think the extraordinary thing at the moment is that we saw this circumstance where the Chinese Navy circumnavigated Australia, conducted a live fire exercise off our coast, and to put that into some sort of historic perspective, the last time that a non-ally fired shots off our coast was during the Second World War, when the Japanese Navy was firing on our shipping and into the city of Sydney. So we now have an extraordinary circumstance where the Australian public is more concerned about the American president than they are about the Chinese president. Now, I'm concerned about both, but that will be the thing this will be the thing that occupies the Australian government, is how do we navigate between these two powers? They say that they've settled the relationship with China. Well, I would say that if settling the relationship with China is having the Chinese Navy off your coastline, I don't see how that's settled. What we've done is decided that we'll be silent about the things that China does. And I don't know how you make the argument for more defence spending if you've decided that you're not going to be quite explicit about what the chief threat is. So I think the government finds itself in a difficult circumstance now. It has to spend more money on defence. We have to assume that we may well, if push comes to shove, be defending ourselves alone. And I'll finish on this point. I'm not saying that the Australian mainland is under any threat of imminent occupation. No country would want to do that. The Japanese didn't want to do that during the Second World War. It is too large and would take too much time and effort to do. But we can easily be isolated, because we are, and people forget this, an island. And on this island, we have 2 weeks worth of fuel. So if we have to worry about our supply lanes to our east and to our west, then that's a pretty big issue, when we just proved the fact that the Australian Navy cannot circumnavigate Australia because our 2 fuel ships are in dry dock.
Thanks, Chris. Let's dive right into the defense budget and how the government has talked about strategic circumstances, how the government has and has not talked about China as the major change, and how it finds itself, as you said, as an ant navigating between the giant poles and elephants of the US and China. Laura, you've written rather recently that both sides indeed have called for increased defense spending, although we'll note that maybe at different levels during the campaign. I think you wrote that, quote, Australia needs a major structural change in our budget, more taxes, to be blunt. How does the new government plan to pay for increased defense spending? And maybe going to Stephen's question too, about what people heard when they were campaigning, 80% of people had concerns about Donald Trump's, 90% of those were negative. How would the Australian public be likely to react to calls for this increased spending? Laura, why don't we start with you on that one?
Well, no, the Australian public will probably react like any public does, Charles, about the idea of more taxes, which is why you have to start the conversation at making the case for why you need more spending. And I think the interesting thing about this particular sort of combination of events that we're seeing at the moment is it actually allows Australia to have a sort of more nuanced discussion about this, in the sense that AUKUS, it's sort of tended to be AUKUS and America or nothing, and I think what is happening now is we've been seeing, even in what we hear from Washington, a bit of pause where people are saying, well, actually, is that the best thing for us to be doing? Questions about numbers of submarines, all those sorts of things going on. But is that the best thing for the Australians to be spending their money on? Is it the best thing for Australia to be spending its money on strategically? As Chris says, we're hearing amongst the sort of glitterati of the defence establishment in Australia a much more of a pushback to focusing on what our strategy actually is, as in it's not just something where we're relying on our close relationship with the United States. It's about going back to what's called the Defence of Australia strategy. It's about thinking about protecting our sea lanes to the north. It's not about, as Chris says, it's not about threat of invasion, but it's about actually saying, well, here we are, this is the reality now. We are stuck between our major ally and our major trading partner. But I think the new tilt on that, thanks to Donald Trump, is that the question is being asked, and I mean, it's something that's been war gamed in Australia amongst all the defence strategists, but it is now very real that there's this prospect that you might see two trade blocs develop, built around roughly China and the US. And so the question that's starting to be asked is, well, what would we do? And so the question, I think, has become much more focused on, actually, we may have to resolve this as a first round effect in terms of our trade relationships. What we do if the world does break down into these two groups, rather than going, what do we do if the US goes to war over Taiwan? So I think, there's a really fascinating series of threads coming out of the debate now, which will sort of form a lot more nuanced discussion, or gives both sides of politics, but certainly the government, the capacity to sort of say, well, look, yes, there's AUKUS, but let's put that aside for a moment, if you like. I mean, what we've spent in additional money in the last couple of years for defence is all about AUKUS. And what others are saying, including the coalition in its fairly incoherent fashion, was we actually have to spend money on a whole range of other things, both in terms of acquisition, sustainment and personnel. Like a lot of defence forces around the world, ours have been run down in terms of the number of people we've got. And so, it's a much broader discussion. In Australia's case, it's also a discussion about our industry base, because without a doubt, AUKUS was about developing our industrial manufacturing base, which we don't have much of. So I think all of those elements probably go into how the discussion goes in selling to the Australian public the idea that we do need more defence spending, and therefore it won't necessarily just be taxes, but it will be, going back to that earlier point I made, it'll be about the fact that not everybody just gets a handout anymore. It'll be about means testing, as we call it in Australia, and targeting support in the community to people who most need it.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this because I think that there's a trick and a trap for Australia's political leaders on this front. I guess the trap, which is the trick, is to say defense spending needs to rise, which all parties have agreed to, because Donald Trump has said it needs to rise. No Australian government in the world in its history would do that just because the United States tells you to. The second predicate, though, is Australian defense spending needs to rise because strategic circumstances have really cratered and Australia finds itself in a worse position. That's somewhat hard, though, to disaggregate the two and lay down the argument that spending needs to rise because of the change in strategic circumstances. As Chris, I think, wrote the other week, because Australia finds itself, I'm using your colorful phrase, friend, alone and naked at the bottom of the world. I guess I would ask Chris on this one, what do you see as the prospects for the new government, which is the old government, disaggregating those two, talking more bluntly than it has in the past about not only changed strategic circumstances, but China to lay down a predicate to call for increased defense spending up to 2.33% of GDP, maybe beyond that. They didn't say that they would go beyond that. I'm curious how you see the prospects of this in the public narrative.
I think this is an extremely difficult thing for the Labor Party to do because it's made a big deal about the fact that it's settled the relationship with China. And now for those people who had forgotten or perhaps didn't pay attention to it at the time, but we were economically coerced by China after the Morrison government called for investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Now, there were plenty of people inside Australia who said that was strategically stupid at the time. I thought it was perfectly reasonable for a government that had just locked down its entire population and would spend $500 billion trying to keep the economy afloat to ask the question about where that disease came from. And I didn't see anyone else in the world sticking their hand up for that. So Morrison gets pilloried for that, but I actually think that was a pretty reasonable question to ask. And the response of the Chinese Communist Party was to isolate Australia and punish it. And we've seen this many times. So it picked us out, it picked the fight. And in fact, it didn't win that fight. And I thought that it was a reasonable thing to make that stand. And I thought that we gained some ground out of that. We gained some traction out of that. Now, the government came to power. The Labor Party saying it wanted to settle that relationship, and it settled it by its silence. And silence means consent. Essentially, that's the only thing that China wants from Australia, is to buy its silence. And to me, that's an enormous thing to give up, because there are plenty of reasons why we should be belling the cat at the moment about the way that China behaves. People keep talking about the defence circumstances. There's essentially a grey war raging in Australia at the moment. I've experienced this personally since 2015, when I began writing about what was happening inside our borders, about essentially the attempt to buy off our political parties. In 2016, 2017, we published the amount of Chinese Communist Party money that was going to all political parties, the work of the United Front inside Australia, the fact that I had Chinese Australians basically whistled up by the Chinese embassy to come and lecture me about what I was doing. That deeply disturbed me, about the fact that the Chinese diaspora here is constantly under threat or is being leveraged by the Chinese Communist Party. And can I say, a big issue in our elections now, and the reason that we're not speaking about this is because there's 1.5 million Australian Chinese. Some of them are in very important electorates, and they're in enough numbers that they can shift those seats, which is why now the coalition has gone silent on China. So we find ourselves in a strategically very difficult position. We need to be able to talk about the threat of the Chinese Communist Party to the Australian people. But we're worried about talking about that for two reasons: that our trade will suffer, and that internally we'll create a domestic problem for the Chinese Australian community. I recognise those things are problems. But if the Australian government intends to spend more money on defence, it has to make the case as to why. What I'd say at the moment is we now face problems with two presidents. We've always relied on the United States and seen it as a constant. It is now a variable. So we have to take more of the weight of our own defence. And the Chinese Communist Party is a real and present danger in our region. And if China does take Taiwan, then what that would do, just in terms of the disruption of our trade in this region, would be absolutely monumental. But I don't think that the Australian Labor Party is going to have that conversation with the Australian people. So I don't think they'd think why they should bother spending more money or paying more taxes on a threat that they can't see.
Could I butt in there? Is that all right?
Please do.
Look, I would take issue with it's more terminology than anything. I mean, Chris, you always sort of say that the government settled the relationship. I don't know that that's the way I would read it. That they talk about normalising it, which is basically bringing it back from that sort of precipice that it hit after COVID. I mean, I agree that people don't understand exactly what the influence of China is in Australia, and that's certainly true. But that in part is part of the job that I think we've got to do, which is we've got to actually pragmatically, well, two things I think, well, there's two things. One of them is we've got to pragmatically sort of actually speak about, you know, what are the threats? You know, I mean, it's not invasion, but people don't really, you know, there's no discussion about what the threat to China from China might be, and you know what therefore the appropriate defence response is. But also, I think what it does mean is that we need to change our relationships with a whole heap of other people, and I think we're sort of seeing the start of that. I mean, the fact that Indonesia features so little in our national conversation is, gobsmacking, really. Our nearest powerful neighbour, which is right near all of those sea lanes. I mean, there's so many, our relationships with Japan, with South Korea, the whole Southeast Asian region are sort of going to be so different. And it's not just, we've often talked here about, we've got to have more relationships with the region and everything, but they are defined now differently because of what's happening with both China and the US. So I think, we have to spread our interests a little bit more broadly and see them a bit more broadly than just purely in that binary sort of way.
Let me jump in here for a second, because one area where clearly there's been a massive growth in Australia's relationship building with its near neighbors is in the Pacific. We can kind of tick through all the agreements that this government has made a priority and has begun to carry out. Stephen, I know you follow this actually very, very closely. And you wrote recently, this is always unfair when someone quotes your own words against you, but you wrote that there's a contest underway during the election over which major party is better placed to build and protect Australia's critical relationships, as Laura was just discussing. And you focus this squarely on the Pacific. Can you just kind of run us through a bit of how the Labor government advanced its diplomatic presence in the Pacific? And really, if that was before, considering the number of agreements that it's now signed, what's next in the Pacific for Australia?
Labor has struck a frenetic pace in the Pacific over the last 3 years. As you say, Charles, I'm lucky enough to follow this closely, and really it's an extraordinarily long list of agreements that have been signed. So just for people who aren't following this quite as obsessively as I am, you've seen over the last 3 years, Labor strike entirely, or the Australian government strike, new agreements with both Nauru and Tuvalu, which essentially involve those countries taking either money or migration pathways to Australia, and in return offering what could be termed loosely security guarantees to Australia, giving Australia the right to veto security arrangements with third countries, which aren't specified, but probably don't take a huge amount of imagination to guess at, largely China and to a far lesser degree, countries like Russia or possibly Azerbaijan, interestingly, but that's another story. We don't need to go down that one. On top of that, it's also struck a new defence agreement with Papua New Guinea. It has opened a new migration pathway to Australia, which will see more Pacific Islanders coming here to settle permanently. It's established a new policing initiative, which essentially puts Australia at the hub of what could be termed loosely a hub and spokes sort of approach to regional policing. Again, that's done with strategic denial at its heart. This is about China. This is about stopping China from establishing itself as a major policing player in the region, as it has already done in Solomon Islands. And that's only about half the list. I won't go into any more detail, but you've seen an extraordinary diplomatic effort from this government to try and entrench its position in the Pacific and to try and lock China out. Now, what happens next? Look, I think we're probably going to see more agreements struck by this government. The government ran during the election what was, I think, a moderately effective line that the coalition's efforts in the Pacific would be manifestly inadequate because of the Pacific's hostility towards Dutton on climate change. I thought that argument at times was a bit overstated, but broadly speaking was true, because there is deep-seated hostility, or at least suspicion in the Pacific towards the coalition on climate, fairly or not. I think it's likely that we'll see more agreements struck. Already we know, for example, the government's working on a new agreement with Vanuatu after that country pushed back its attempt to strike a broad security pact with that country. We're likely to see a new policing agreement with Solomon Islands finalised, which will see Australia pour several $100 million into expanding Solomon Islands police force. Again, that's done with more than one eye on China to try and minimise the role that it can play. And I suspect that we will still see Australia trying to nudge at countries like Kiribati and others, which it would like to strike similar Fallapili Union-style agreements with. How successful they'll be, I don't know. Most of that low-hanging fruit has now probably been plucked. But it is, as the Foreign Minister puts it, a permanent contest in the Pacific, and it's not going to die away anytime soon.
On permanent contest, kind of swinging away from Australia for a second, and when we look at the U.S.-China optic, Chris noted this at the beginning, that now the main task of the government is navigating between those two poles, with, I think you said that there are now two uncertain variables in the equation, Chris. Look, Stephen and Laura and you all mentioned this in your initial comments. I want to swing to the U.S. For a second before we talk about China. The hot take that you're hearing on the election, Stephen, I appreciate the nuance that you gave us, but the hot take you're hearing is that Trump played a role in the outcome, maybe the decisive role you're hearing from some quarters, certainly in the American press. Chris, do you buy that line, or is it more complicated than that, that Trump influenced decisively the election as he did in Canada?
It was nowhere near as decisive as it was in Canada because it was completely overt there. But I draw the parallels that the opposition leader there lost his job as they lost that election, and the opposition leader lost his job as they lost that election. And I thought from the outset, from early in this year, when the coalition was saying, Dutton was saying, I'll be better able to deal with Donald Trump. Well, that's like saying, I'm the friend of the guy who just broke the bottle in the bar. It doesn't necessarily inspire you with confidence that you'd be able to deal more easily with that. And I think the Albanese government had it all over the coalition with that. And just look at the language. Like someone once said to me, if you want to know what we really think, listen to what we say, particularly in our advertising. Look at the Prime Minister's speech when he claimed victory. He said we didn't need to import ideas from overseas. He wasn't talking about China. He was talking about the ideas, the cultural fights that he would claim that the coalition was bringing into Australia, which he would see as an Americanization of Australian politics. They talk about the Americanization of Australia's healthcare system, which is very dear to the heart of Australian people. The Medicare system is one of those things that really is a bedrock of our health system. So the president was a constant presence in this campaign. And I think it's a remarkable thing. Look, and I say this from the point of view, I'm the son of a soldier who was a soldier his entire working life. He served in Vietnam alongside the Americans throughout the course of my lifetime. That has been a constant. I don't think an American audience can actually appreciate what this means, but to summarize it, during the Second World War, Australia's always basically relied on big friends to help it, right? So it was always the United Kingdom, but during the Second World War, when Singapore fell, Australia felt exposed, completely exposed to a Chinese military that was moving at a ridiculous pace towards our shores, got to Papua New Guinea, bombed Darwin. As I said, my mother remembers the sound of the ferry being sunk in Sydney Harbour. She remembered, I should say, she's dead now, but that idea that America was there to help us, there were American troops that were based out of Australia, that we could rely on the United States. We have built our security around that, never really had to think about it. Donald Trump is making us think about that, and making us think about that unsettles Australians. As I say, I think it is an extraordinary achievement that an American president has managed to get us to a position where we're more worried about that president than we are about the president of China, who is, I feel, a much more real and present danger. Now, America's politics is a matter for America. I understand the rage that people felt. I was in Virginia in 2016, in West Virginia, down in Logan County. And the thing I took away from that before the American election was there were a group of people there who felt abandoned by all politics. They didn't want someone to go to Washington and fix it. They wanted someone to go to Washington and burn it down. So I understand where that rage comes from. But at the moment, what's happening is the entire world is being unsettled by the US president. He's changing a settlement that all of us believed worked and we understood. We are now in uncharted waters. So I think that the underlying thing in all that is Australians felt unsettled by that, and they want a sense of security, and the Australian Labor Party was offering it.
Yeah, from a general sense, particular policies, I'm curious how that will translate. Laura, you've probably watched the same polling that I have, that even since January, Australians' perceptions of American trustworthiness have plummeted. The Lowy Institute does year-on-year polling, and we've seen a precipitous drop. Record low numbers for Australian trust in the United States at this moment. And taking that general sentiment, I'm curious how you think and whether labor will feel compelled to reflect this in their policies.
I think I don't think they'll feel compelled. I mean, one observation I'd make, which is sort of emerged during the campaign when I was talking to people offline, was one interesting sort of aspect of this, Charles, is to sort of think what were the possible responses that Australia could have had to Liberation Day. Now, I know I'm talking about trade more than defence, but as I say, I think that's sort of a prism which we need to think about. I think that there would have been a very large part of the Prime Minister's brain where the first instinct would have been retaliatory tariffs. Not because that was a sensible thing to do, but just because that's sort of where he's come from, in a sort of a political history sort of way. The fact that he didn't do that, I think, is a sign that it's unlikely, that would happen, or that that we'd see anything other than, I suppose the election result itself has reinforced to him, which is always terrifying, the idea that he's right about his strategy, which was, and I sort of slightly disagree with Chris on this. I don't think Australia's gone to the left. I think it's gone to the centre, because the Greens, who are to the left of Labor, have also been sort of wiped out to a large extent in this election. So he's a centrist. He's a cautious policy maker. So he's not going to be doing anything really radical in terms of distancing Australia from the US. He's going to be basically trying to do things where we just get on with it, and just say, that's nice, dear, to the American administration, trying to minimise the damage, develop our relationships with Europe at a furious pace. I mean, for example, the European Free Trade Agreement, which has been sitting on a shelf for quite a long time, is suddenly being elevated. And so I don't think it's going to necessarily sort of result in material changes in policies that affect our relationship, but it'll just be a question of just saying, well, we'll just leave it to the Americans to work out what they're going to do about this guy. We've got to get on with it and make relationships with other parts of the world much more important to us.
Can I jump in just quickly on that, Charles? I think that's absolutely right. The other thing that I just add to what Laura said is that it's interesting to see that there are now some quiet conversations happening at an officials level, at the very least, about, to use a phrase that one High Commissioner here in Canberra used a little while ago, is like, what furniture can we save and how do we save it best together without the Americans? So in a strange way, the Australian system, I'm talking about officials here, I guess, rather than politicians, is sort of just frozen with mute horror at the moment with what's happening in the US. And I'm picking up an awful lot of indecision and fear rather than anything else. I'm not getting a sense that there are people in the Australian system confidently sketching out a way forward, simply because the choices that we face in this current moment are so damn invidious, right? But there is the beginning of a discussion, I think, between countries like Japan, Australia, to a degree, South Korea, the Europeans, the Canadians, definitely, about exactly what we need to do collectively in response. Now, this is going to be a vastly difficult exercise, because although we have an awful lot of common ground, we also have divergent interests, and no one wants to go out on a limb here and put their head on the chopping block. As someone put it to me, you don't want the eye of Sauron from Washington, turning towards you at the moment, because you're perceived to be a bit too forward leaning. But there is a discussion that is now just starting to coalesce, I think, between some of these countries, which excludes the US and state, not because they don't like state, they love state, but just because they are not convinced that state can do a damn thing in this particular moment with Trump in the White House. And that is a conversation which is in its early stages, but is, I think, one that's really worth tracking.
Yeah, I do want to come back to that before we conclude. But if we're considering the full suite of challenges that the incoming government has to kind of tick through as it begins to kind of think about what else, what more, and what new, Stephen. We've glancingly chatted about China, but this is one that's front and center. Let me turn my attention there for a second. For Americans who aren't following the Australian press quite as closely, I wanted to read a somewhat extraordinary op-ed that came out about 2 weeks ago, written by Xiao Qian, China's ambassador to Australia, where he wrote that the U.S. was turning the world, quote, into a lawless jungle, and he demanded that the Australian government stand with Beijing against Washington's unilateral bullying. If that was something of an extraordinary op-ed, there was an extraordinary response to that op-ed written by Chris Uhlmann on our conversation right here. I'm going to quote unfairly, I'm sure, but you wrote it from your response, Chris. Perhaps you wrote, Xiao thinks we're stupid, as he would have us forget what China has done and focus only on what it says. Your conclusion was that you wouldn't trust Beijing to run a chook raffle. First, please, for an American audience, explain what a chook raffle is. And then slightly more seriously, what was Ambassador Xiao trying to achieve? Did it work? And maybe zooming out a bit further, where do you think Australia's China policy is going to look different, if at all, in a second Albanese term, now that he's more firmly in power?
Well, to start with, a chook is a chicken, and a raffle, obviously, everyone would understand. And we often have meat raffles, not necessarily chicken raffles, in pubs on a Friday and Saturday night in Australia. And saying you wouldn't trust someone to run a chook raffle means that they're not incapable of doing even the most simple thing. And the reason I use that is because the Chinese Communist Party quite often uses Chinese idioms, Confucian ones. That was the stuff they tried to actually eradicate during the Cultural Revolution. One of the things that was said to me during the time that Australia was being economically coerced by the China is, well, you've got to kill a chicken to scare the monkey. So I thought it was reasonable to run Australian idiom back by them. I actually was going to use, I hope all your chooks turn to emus and kick your dunny down. An emu is a big bird about the size of an ostrich, and a dunny is an outside toilet. And I wish I had used that now, because, look, I've got to say that this is the strategic space that the United States is now opening up for China. If China can sell itself as a friend of free trade, this was the argument that he was making, and that we should band together to protect an international system that China had no hand in building and is doing everything in its power now to dismantle, then I think we're completely foolish. But that's where the United States has left this, because the system of alliances that it's so carefully built over such a long period of time is now being unraveled. Now, it's entirely up to the American administration about what it wants to do about that. But as I understand it, the United States understands its biggest strategic challenge is also China. I would have thought the best thing that you could possibly do was to try and leverage your alliances. At the moment, the rhetoric we hear coming out of Washington is that the president seems to be more disposed to dealing with Russia and China than it is to dealing with Canada, Mexico, Australia, Japan, South Korea. So I don't understand the thinking behind that. I don't pretend to understand it. And I think that what Stephen says is absolutely true. How do we respond to administration which changes its point of view on almost every day? We'll give you one example, that the 145% tariffs that were slapped on China by the president. He hasn't had any negotiations with China at the moment, and he's already bidding himself down. So I don't understand how this works or can pretend where we might go in the future. The only thing I get out of all of this is that an Australian government is paying attention, and I agree with Laura and Stephen on this. We actually have to look at the alliances that the United States helped to build. Japan in particular, South Korea, the people in our region, Indonesia, the Indians as well. And we have to see what we can salvage among ourselves from all of that. But fundamentally, Australia is going to have to take the worst case scenario, which is, can we defend ourselves on our own? And how do we go about doing that? Through our diplomatic arrangements with other countries, but also through our defence arrangements. And that can't point to anything other than spending more money on defence. And it gets back to the fundamental point is, in order to convince the Australian people that you need to do that, you have to make the case that there is a credible threat. And I believe that there's a credible threat.
Look, I'm mindful of the time, but I think that this conversation has really helpfully been circling around and underscoring for an American audience, if not an Australian audience too, that there's a lot in the air, there's a lot in the water right now. And there's new thinking, even if it's nascent and immature at this stage. We've seen it referred to on the op-ed pages in Australia as, is it time for a plan B for Australia? Now, look, in a very narrow sense, a plan B, increasing calls for a plan B, is literally just about AUKUS. What does it mean for Australia if it doesn't get its Virginia-class submarines on the timeline that it was hoping to? But I actually want to park that one aside because I think this is a larger conversation, not only about AUKUS. Chris, you've talked about this. Laura, you talked about this. Stephen, you talked about this. In a larger sense, it's a much broader question of how Australia can deal with a less reliable US and a more aggressive China. And while we've seen greater calls on the op-ed page and even by some former senior political and policy officials, I'm curious, Stephen, you said something that there's like a little bit of work being done, but really a lot of clutching at pearls right now. And I guess I would ask each of you before we wrap, is this all talk at this point? Is it serious? And maybe, and this is the more interesting point, what would this begin to look like if we're throwing out some of the long-held assumptions? Why don't we go with Stephen first on that, then Chris and Laura, if you don't mind, with concluding thoughts.
Well, I'll just do very briefly, Charles. The problem with Plan Bs is that every single plausible plan that you could lay out has to imagine at least some sort of role for the US in our region. Any plausible attempt to balance Chinese power without the heft that the US brings very quickly looks very, very forlorn. And similarly, whilst Australia has definitely got to do more to defend itself and invest in more capabilities, we shouldn't forget the fact that, we remain entirely reliant on high US technology, sophisticated US technology for almost all of our platforms. So disentangling the US from any sort of grand strategy for the region is frankly, as far as I can tell, a fairly hopeless task. Which is why I think the focus is, when you talk about a plan B, is less how can we deal without America and more how can we deal with a much more unreliable, a much more mercurial, worryingly perhaps a less democratic, and a much more unpredictable US presence in the region. What are the essential components of US statecraft and interests that we can actually draw on to try and form some sort of lasting regional balance? I think that's the conversation that's happening at the moment. It's not about Australia alone or the region without the US. It's about trying to work with a very different US where we can be much less certain about its commitments.
Laura, you alluded to this point earlier, just talking about the need for an uptick in relationship building. We kind of got more specific in talking about the Pacific, but there's also Southeast Asia. There's also the major other power players. How do you think about this? What do you think should be towards the top of the list about how Canberra is now thinking about the new position that it finds itself in?
Well, I think it's trying to think all on the positive, Charles, as in it's not sort of, I don't pick up that it's going all, for example, if it was thinking negatively, it would be going, do we really want to be, should we be recalibrating Five Eyes if we think the Americans might be giving intel to Russia? That would be sort of seeing it in an alarmist way. I don't think that's going on, but I think there is this positive thing of saying, okay, we've got to really step up. There's a lot more talk about Japan. I think the Prime Minister is going to be going to Indonesia pretty soon. So it's about actually probably reviving things that have gone into abeyance, like a security relationship with Indonesia. I think it will, I know we're not going to talk about AUKUS as such, but I think it does mean that things that were sort of completely rejected by the establishment even 12 months ago, like saying, as your Congressional Research Service says, look, maybe, you know, we should just sort of give up on this idea that we're going to buy American submarines. You know, the Americans can come and park here if they want, whatever. But, you know, we will have to actually change our defence strategic relationship so that they're not driven by the implications that you get from AUKUS. It will be about something slightly different, and it'll be about spending our money differently on technology. As Stephen says, we're obviously technologically very reliant on you, but the technology of warfare is changing so rapidly, as we see in Ukraine at the moment, that all of those things are sort of going to go into a melting pot where, you know, we could see a potentially very different mindset coming out of Canberra.
Chris, I'm going to give you final word, but your final word has to be reaction to my final words. Look, I think Stephen laid this out really well, just to kind of reinforce the point that without the United States, there is no balance in the region, just because of the sheer power disparities. We should also say that it's very clear that there is a hard cap on what the Australian government is willing to put towards defense. It's going up, but it's not going up steeply or very quickly. And I guess the way that I look at this, and you can tell me if this is how you look at this or if there's a better way to look at this, is as these conversations evolve, as Laura was saying about who else in the region, as Stephen says, you know, people sharpening their pencils at DFAT and Russell. I think about this in terms of three different categories. What Australia needs to be doing with the United States, even as it becomes more politically difficult, and which things need to be accelerated further with the US, point one. Point two, what Australia should be doing independent of the United States around the region. And point three, things that Australia needs to do with no one but itself, that is funding, resources, and the way that it talks about the challenge. Are those the right categories to begin to think about a slightly different take on Australia's national security?
Yeah, and I think I'll start with the last one first. So you always should control the things that you can control. The things that we can control are the decisions that we make. So first we have to work out what our strategy is, and Stephen's absolutely right. A lot of head scratching going on. I don't blame them, because we don't know from one day to the next what the policy is going to necessarily be. So it is a fluid circumstance, but we need to work out what our strategy is going to be and then work towards that. We need to keep the United States strategically involved in this region. That is an absolute. All I was saying about it is that it's become a variable where once upon a time it was a constant. I think in any negotiation with the United States, Australia has to show a certain sense of dignity. I don't want us going to the United States bargaining with critical minerals. What we should bargain with is 100 years worth of alliance with the United States, that we sit in a strategically important position of the world that is strategically important to the United States. And it actually does need us. We might be a small player, but we're an important one. And so I don't think that Anthony Albanese should offer anything more than Australia already gives, but apart from saying that we will step up on defence. But we're not going to be bargaining here with our dignity, because some of the language coming out of the United States doesn't show that they're treating other countries with any dignity. And so I think that, you know, that's got to be met with a certain sense of strength. We also have to meet China with a certain sense of strength, which is to say, these are our red lines. These are points where we don't believe that if you cross them, that we should not respond. And on that front, I think there have to be consequences. What we saw in the South China Sea was people kept saying, you know, stop building islands, please don't militarize Ireland, and there were no consequences. If there are no consequences for China, then it will continue to step forward. So across all the fronts that you talk about and all the stuff we've been talking about today, we face an extraordinarily difficult set of circumstances. But any response should begin with, we've got to control those things that we can control. We do need to spend more on defence. We do need to work more on our regional alliances. We have to try and convince the United States that there is value in the relationship that it already has, and we sit in a strategically important part of the world that is important to America. So it's in America's best interests and in the president's best interests to make sure that this alliance is as strong as it possibly can be.
Terrific. Look, I find myself at the end of an hour here somewhat surprised that so quickly we moved on to a truly substantive discussion from the political fray and hurly-burly that was playing out. Really, they're still counting seats as we go. I'm enormously appreciative to the three of you for taking the time to get up. I would note, again, for American friends, we have three true heavyweights of Australian political and policy analysis on the line here. Please make sure you read what they have to say as the situation evolves. Please make sure that you check out what CSIS commentary continues to produce on this very front. And at this point, I'd like to thank our panelists for a terrific conversation. The agenda, the inbox is very long, as is clear. But staying with your analysis will help us understand where Australia might go in the period moving forward. Thanks all very much for tuning into this conversation.